Do you want me to let Sainz through too? Brutal words from Hamilton to his engineer after being forced to let Leclerc by. Stay until the end to witness Hamilton's shocking reaction. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The Miami Grand Prix was designed to be Ferrari's defining moment, a bold statement to the rest of the grid, a declaration that the old Titans had returned not just with horsepower and heritage, but with the most dangerous weapon of all, ambition cloaked in elegance. It wasn't supposed to be a race. It was meant to be a narrative, a turning point, the culmination of months of behind-the-scenes work, high-stakes contract negotiations, and a delicate alliance between two of the most intriguing characters in modern motorsport. Charles Leclerc, the razor-sharp Monégasque prodigy, already forged in Ferrari's furnace, and Lewis Hamilton, the icon, the disruptor, the man who had turned silver into gold and who had now traded it for red, not to retire, but to conquer all over again. The Miami skyline shimmered like a CGI painting. Luxury yachts floated just meters from the track, while influencers posed for curated photos that would be published before the race even ended. Netflix cameras hovered like vultures, waiting for storylines. And the pressure inside the Ferrari garage wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. This wasn't just about tire wear or DRS zones. This was about identity. About control. About who really called the shots when two alpha drivers shared the same shade of red. What happened during the race was not an explosion, but an implosion. An unraveling of the internal order, masked by race suits and sunglasses. It started slowly, imperceptibly, the way all betrayals do. From the outside, things looked calm. Hamilton, composed and commanding, had executed a flawless opening stint. His getaway off the line had been surgical, neither aggressive nor hesitant, but deliberate. In one sweeping move, he had jumped a Red Bull and established dominance behind Norris. His pace was consistent. His tire degradation minimal. His feedback to the engineers precise, measured, confident. He was the strategist's dream. The team leader Ferrari had long fantasized about. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. Leclerc, meanwhile, was slightly out of rhythm. Struggling early with grip and corner rotation, he had spent the first part of the race recalibrating. But then, fortune offered an opportunity, a VSC window that allowed a perfectly timed double stack. Both Ferraris returned to the track with fresh rubber, but something had shifted. Leclerc now had marginally better grip. The kind of microscopic advantage that on paper meant very little, but inside Ferrari's war room, it meant chaos. Telemetry came in. A few tenths per lap. Nothing dramatic. But the narrative began to form. Leclerc was faster. Leclerc was coming. And in Ferrari, where perception often overrides logic, that was enough. There was no patience. No long-term view. The obsession with optics, with satisfying internal hierarchies and avoiding driver clashes, became the priority. What if Charles catches Lewis and they touch? What if Lewis defends too hard? What if it costs both podiums? The fear wasn't mechanical, it was political. Then came the message. Lewis, we need to let Charles through. No explanation. No options. No plan B. It was a cold command, not a request. And it wasn't just a strategy call, it was a test of loyalty. Of control. Hamilton, who had done everything right up to that point, who had defended flawlessly, extended his stint, read the race like a novel, was being asked to move over. To make way. Not for a car that had demonstrably earned it, but for a team dynamic that had silently tilted out of balance. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The response was a masterclass in restraint. No sarcasm. No argument. Just understood. But inside the cockpit, a storm was building. Not a tempest of rage, but a calculation. A data-driven fury. Hamilton let Leclerc pass with eerie precision, then shadowed him, not as a teammate, but as an analyst. Every braking zone. Every exit. Every decision. Hamilton wasn't following, he was documenting. Learning. Storing every mistake, every weakness, for future battles. The paddock noticed. The silence on the radio said more than any team principal ever could. Engineers looked at each other, but said nothing. The garage tried to remain composed. The political damage was done. Because Hamilton is not a driver you control, he is a driver you align with. And in that moment, Ferrari had tilted the scales too far. Leclerc went on to challenge Norris, but the attack lacked venom. The McLaren held firm. The Ferrari didn't have enough in reserve. And Hamilton? He coasted to the finish line mere seconds behind, having spent the final laps proving, to himself, to the team, and to the world, that he had pace in hand all along. That he had obeyed the team. But that he never had to. The aftermath was a PR exercise in avoidance. Leclerc praised the team. Hamilton kept it short. The media tried to bait a reaction. Lewis didn't take it. But his eyes, always more expressive than his answers, burned with clarity. This wasn't over. Not even close. In the days that followed, whispers began to circulate. That Hamilton had remained on site late into the evening. That he had skipped the post-race team dinner. That meetings were rescheduled. That his longtime race engineer had voiced concern over how the decision was handled. That a planned media day in Maranello had been suddenly postponed. The cracks were no longer hidden. What Ferrari underestimated was not Hamilton's ego, but his memory. His ability to absorb injustice and turn it into fuel. He doesn't retaliate immediately. He waits. Plans. When he strikes, it's devastatingly effective, not just on the scoreboard, but in the hearts and minds of those who doubted him. The psychological warfare had begun. The next time Leclerc and Hamilton enter a corner together, it won't just be about apexes and grip. It will be layered. Strategic. Laced with history. The next strategy meeting won't just be about tires and undercuts, it will be about trust. And Ferrari, once so proud of their legacy, must now navigate a future where their decisions aren't just measured by results, but by respect. Because when you ask a legend to step aside, you better make sure you're prepared for what happens next. Because in this sport, in this brutal, beautiful, manipulative arena we call Formula One, nothing is ever just about what the stopwatch says. It's never simply about who's quicker over one lap, or who's saving tires better through Sector 2. It's not about how many tenths you find through the chicane, or how perfectly you nail the exit of turn 14. It's about trust. It's about loyalty. It's about perception. And above all, it's about power. Who has it, who's losing it, and who's pretending it doesn't matter. That day, the real story wasn't in the lap times. It wasn't even in the overtakes. The real story lived in the silence. In the space between a team order and a driver's reaction. In the way one man gave up track position, not because he wanted to, not because he agreed, but because he understood the cost of disobedience, and because he realized in that moment that the battle he thought he was fighting wasn't the one he was actually in. He had been lured with promises of a revolution, of a team restructured, of a legacy project, built around parity, mutual respect, and the idea of two alphas. They had looked him in the eye and told him, "You will be free here. You will have equal tools, equal voice, equal chance." They had spoken with passion, with urgency. They had made him believe it. And he had wanted to believe. Because after years of carrying a midfield team on his shoulders, dragging an underdog chassis to places it had no business being, he was finally stepping into the castle, the fortress of Formula One history. Ferrari. The team of myth and blood and fire. The team that legends were made in, or broken by. But as he sat in that cockpit, receiving the call to let the favored son through, he realized that the foundations of this castle were built not on fairness, but on narrative. They didn't just want a champion. They wanted their champion. One they could mold. One they could protect. One they had invested years into grooming, both publicly and privately. He didn't hit the brakes. He didn't defy the call. But he made them wait. Just long enough to say everything that couldn't be said out loud. "I know what you're doing. And I won't forget it." And then with a microlift, no radio complaint, no curse, he handed over the position. Charles swept past like a storm, silent and fast, the chosen one soaring into open air. And then, as if choreographed by some cruel director, the next message came. Deadpan. Precise. Sharp. Gap to Carlos behind, 1.2 seconds. And just like that, the trap closed. As if to remind him, don't get any ideas. You're not irreplaceable. You're being watched. The words weren't loud, but the subtext screamed. The pit wall didn't need to say more. They had already said enough with their silence, with their decisions, with their priorities. This was not a conversation. This was a verdict. And yet, he stayed composed. Outwardly. Inwardly, it was carnage. Emotions collided, frustration, betrayal, calculation. But the most dangerous of all was clarity. Because for the first time, he saw it all without illusion. The structure, the politics, the favoritism disguised as strategy. The fact that sometimes it doesn't matter how fast you are, how experienced, how decorated. If you're not the story they want to tell, you're just a page they're willing to tear out. Up ahead, Charles did what was expected. He pulled away, creating the illusion that the decision had been tactical, not political. That he was faster. That this wasn't favoritism, this was logic. The numbers would later back it up. See? He extended the gap. That's the brilliance of these situations. They're built so they can be justified after the fact. Because in F1, the numbers never lie. But how they're interpreted, that's where the truth gets twisted. The engineers went quiet on his radio. The encouragement dried up. The technical chatter turned generic. They no longer fed him information with intent, they just ticked boxes. That's how it always starts. Not with an announcement, but with a cooling of the room. With doors that don't open anymore. With whispers during debriefs. With strategy meetings he's no longer invited to. But he knew. He knew what this meant long before the call came. He'd seen it in the paddock, in how the press were briefed, in how the team posted photos of Charles front and center, in how the media clips were edited. He'd seen the same story before, wearing different colors. At Red Bull. At Mercedes. Even at McLaren, years ago. It always starts the same way. A few strategy favors. A slight bias in upgrades. Then before you know it, you're not delivering, and your contract's being re-evaluated. History repeats itself in red, silver, blue, the paint changes, but the game doesn't. He remembered pre-season. How Charles had access to the sim a full 2 weeks earlier. How his side of the garage got the aero upgrade 2 races before him. How his calls for adjustments were met with "we'll consider it," while Charles's preferences were implemented overnight. It hadn't hit him then. He'd rationalized it. But now, every detail came flooding back, like puzzle pieces snapping into place with cruel clarity. He looked in his mirrors. Carlos wasn't a threat. Not on this stint. But he was a symbol of what happens when the team sees you as second best. Carlos knew that game. He'd played it. Had been both favored and forgotten. And now, watching from behind, he likely understood exactly what had just happened. So he drove. Not to save the race. The podium was slipping away. Not even to win. That dream had been sacrificed at turn 12. He drove to send a message. To remind the world, and the paddock, that he wasn't done. That they had underestimated the wrong man. That if they wanted a compliant number 2, they'd picked the wrong career to ruin. Because he wasn't just a driver, he was a fighter. A strategist. A survivor in a sport designed to eat its own. And somewhere deep in his core, a new voice awakened. Not bitter. Not angry. Just resolute. Cold. Focused. They think this was checkmate. It's not even mid-game. He didn't storm off. He didn't lash out. He didn't throw anything. That would have been easy to dismiss. Just another frustrated athlete venting emotion after a tough race. But Lewis Hamilton was far more dangerous than that. He was composed. Controlled. The kind of control that makes people nervous. The kind of calm that isn't about peace, but power. When he removed his gloves, it was deliberate. When he unfastened the Hans device, it wasn't rushed. He didn't look up. Didn't scan for a camera. Every movement was as precise as his lap times, and just as sharp. The paddock pretended not to stare. Journalists whispered into phones, trying to recalibrate the story they were going to write. Because what just happened wasn't about positions or tire strategies. It was about a shift. An unspoken betrayal that had finally surfaced, undeniable and public. And everyone felt it. The moment he stepped out of Park Ferme, people started moving. Comms officers, assistant engineers, even the junior press liaison, not to assist, but to stay out of the blast zone. He wasn't walking like a man who just finished a Grand Prix. He was walking like a man returning from battle, wounded by friendly fire. Behind him, the other car arrived. Applause rippled through the garage, tentative, uncertain. No one knew whether to celebrate or stay quiet. Some clapped out of habit. Others avoided it entirely. Because the energy had shifted. This wasn't a win. It was an aftershock. Inside the team briefing area, the leadership huddled in private. They weren't reviewing data. They were reviewing damage. Damage they'd inflicted. The data couldn't save them this time. Not when the delta time showed that Hamilton had the pace. Not when the overtake instruction had come without justification. Not when there was no explanation strong enough to excuse a move that reeked of politics. They'd broken a bond. Not with just a driver, but with the driver. The man who'd built the foundation they were now trying to repave without him. When Lewis entered the room, he didn't sit. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Heavy. Direct. Electrifying in its silence. "I'm going to ask once," he said, voice steady but razor-sharp. "Who authorized it?" No one spoke. "You think I'm past it? You think this is the start of your new era? Fine. Say it. But don't pretend it's about data. Don't insult me." The performance engineer looked ready to interject. A glance from Lewis shut it down. "I gave you everything. Races I won in cars that shouldn't have been on the podium. Seasons I carried on my back. I built this team's reputation when the world was calling us a fluke." Still, silence. "You want to test loyalty? You just did. And now you're going to see what happens when I stop protecting your reputation and start protecting mine." One of the analysts tried to bring up tire metrics. Lewis didn't even look at him. "You knew I was faster. You saw the splits. You made the call anyway." No denials. Because there weren't any. He turned toward the door but paused. "You've got one thing right. I'm not going to fight this in meetings. I'm not going to tweet. I'm not going to post vague messages or unfollow people. I'm going to show up in the car. And when I do, I'm not asking for permission anymore." Outside, the press was already spinning. Speculation exploded across social media. Analysts debated strategy calls. Ex-drivers offered surface-level insights. But none of them understood the full depth. They were missing the bigger picture. This wasn't about one race. It was about a slow, calculated shift inside the team, a decision to prioritize optics over results. To slowly dim the light of their most successful asset in order to build up the next big star. And Lewis felt it. Not as a theory, but as a truth delivered in real time, live on track, in front of the world. He didn't need to make threats. He didn't need to be loud. His silence was the message. His stare was the punctuation. He left the garage without speaking to media, and that silence rippled louder than any podium interview could have managed. Back in his hotel room that night, he didn't scroll through the coverage. He didn't check hashtags. He didn't debrief with anyone. He sat on the edge of the bed, replaying the race in his mind, every instruction, every sector, every decision, not with regret, but with clarity. He was done playing the good soldier. Done covering for missteps. Done pretending there wasn't a shift happening within the team. From that moment, something changed. He would still race. Still chase perfection. But not for them. For legacy. For truth. For himself. In the quiet room behind the paddock chaos, away from the cheers and the screeching tires, Charles Leclerc remained composed, unshaken, almost eerily still. No explosive outburst. No signs of triumph either. He had just walked away from one of the most controversial calls of the season, yet there wasn't a single trace of doubt in his demeanor. To him, there had been no gray area. He had felt stuck behind, bottled in, faster than the man ahead. He had said it over the radio, clear and direct. He asked for the position, not out of emotion, but out of conviction. Ferrari had responded, pulled the trigger, and he had done exactly what he promised. He pulled away. The data backed him. The stopwatch didn't lie. The move had worked. From his perspective, it was racing stripped of sentiment. Strategic. Surgical. Done. But while Charles processed the race like a chess master who had sacrificed a piece to gain board control, the world outside the garage processed it more like a betrayal. Because this wasn't just another team order. This was Hamilton. A 7-time world champion. A global icon. A man who had joined Ferrari not as a supporting actor but as a headliner. And when he was asked to move aside, when he was told to surrender track position to the younger homegrown talent, something deeper shifted. You could feel it online within minutes. The temperature on social media surged. Clips of the radio message went viral. Commentators debated. Former drivers took sides. Memes exploded across platforms. This wasn't just drama. This was a cultural flashpoint. And everyone watching knew it. In the cool-down room, the tension was so thick it almost had a physical form. Not a word was exchanged. Not even a glance. Charles sat like a man who had completed a mission. Lewis, meanwhile, exuded a quiet, volcanic rage. He didn't fidget. He didn't flare. He simply existed in silence, but the type of silence that made your skin crawl. The type that screams louder than shouting ever could. The type that says, you crossed a line you didn't know existed. Every frame from that moment became iconic in its own right. The distance between them. The body language. The zero interaction. Viewers didn't need subtitles. They were witnessing the start of a civil war. And it was impossible to look away. The media room was the next battlefield. Charles arrived first. Relaxed shoulders. Calm breath. He spoke of unity, of long-term goals, of how in the heat of competition, sometimes the team has to make tough calls. He said the trust between drivers and engineers was solid. He referenced data, pace, sector times. He didn't gloat, but he didn't backpedal either. His tone was that of a man who knew he had acted within protocol. He mentioned how much he respected Lewis. But his words had edges. Soft-spoken confidence laced with something sharper. Subtext. Then Lewis came in. And everything shifted. His words were few. His tone, precise. He didn't use long paragraphs. He didn't need to. Every word he chose felt intentional, like punctuation marks in a sentence meant to convey disappointment, not defeat. I did what I was asked. I held my ground. Then I was told to give it up. That's what happened. Full stop. The brevity wasn't passive-aggressive. It was just aggressive enough. You could hear the betrayal not in what he said, but in what he didn't bother to elaborate on. And in Formula One, that's where the real messages live. Because Hamilton doesn't lash out. He logs. He archives. He remembers. And when he feels cornered, he doesn't retreat, he recalibrates. You could almost see it in his eyes. Calculations being run, scenarios being played out, future races already forming in his mind. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more volatile. What makes this so explosive isn't just the clash of egos, it's the collision of expectations. Charles Leclerc is Ferrari's crown jewel. He was built in their system, raised in their culture. For years, he suffered through underwhelming machinery, bad calls, internal disarray, all while remaining loyal. He bleeds red, and for the Tifosi, that matters. But Lewis Hamilton was invited to Ferrari. Recruited. Promised a platform to rewrite history. To become the man who brought the Scuderia back to championship glory. He didn't come to be a co-star. He came to lead. And now, just 5 races into the season, that narrative is already under threat. Internally, Ferrari is entering dangerous territory. The garage is split, not officially, not yet. But in tone, in mood, in small moments. Engineers whisper in corners. Strategists hesitate. Every decision now has double weight. What's best for the race, and what's best for the dynamic. And in a team already infamous for pressure, missteps, and politics, this level of instability could prove fatal. In the days following Miami, sources close to the paddock began whispering. Hamilton's camp wasn't just frustrated, they were strategizing. There were questions being asked, not just about what happened, but why. Why was the call made? Who decided? What precedent does this set? Is there a hierarchy being implied? A future being shaped without transparency? Meanwhile, Leclerc's team, aware of the incoming heat, doubled down. Behind closed doors, they pointed to the data. His pace was stronger, his tire management cleaner, his chances of pressuring the Red Bulls higher. They framed the swap not as favoritism, but as optimization. The right call. The necessary call. But when necessity clashes with narrative, the latter always wins in the media cycle. And now comes Emola. A track not just rich with history, but burdened with ghosts. Ferrari's backyard. A cauldron of passion and pressure. The tifosi won't just be watching, they'll be expecting, demanding. Every move will be amplified. Every order will be scrutinized. The media will flood every press conference with variations of the same question. Has Ferrari already lost control of their dream team? In that garage, the air will be thick with diplomacy. Smiles will be forced. Body language will be choreographed. But behind those visors, both Charles and Lewis will know exactly where they stand. Charles knows this could be his moment to fully assert control, to show that Ferrari should be his ship to steer. Lewis, on the other hand, will be quietly preparing to remind the world why you never count out a giant. And when he responds, it won't be with words. It will be with lap times. With tire strategy. With pure, undeniable racecraft. The truth is, Ferrari didn't just swap positions in Miami. They flipped a switch. They lit a fuse. And now, they're racing toward a powder keg. Because this isn't just a story about racing anymore. It's about identity, legacy, leadership, and ambition colliding inside the most iconic team in motorsport. And if you thought Miami was controversial, buckle up, what comes next could shatter everything.